Welcome to the Liz McMullen Show. I have a guest on who is quite prolific. She has been writing full time since 1985. Her name is Susan Albert, and I'd like to welcome you to the show.
Hi, it's good to be with you. Thanks for asking me.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. And what was interesting is Michelle Carlsberg, who's a publicist, she had pointed me in the direction of your novel as well as Vanda's novel called Juliana. And when I first was introduced to both of your names, I had no idea that I'd be reading two historicals. And I have just recently published a anthology of historical fiction, so it was interesting to get some more historical experience. What attracts you to historical fiction?
Well, I think I'm a fact-based person. I like stories that are rooted in the real world, and fiction that has its roots, has its parameters defined for it by real-world activities really appeals to me. I like fanciful fiction, yes, as a reader, but when I'm writing, real-world fiction gives me something to go by, especially real-world fiction that has real-world people in it. I've done historical mystery with my husband using real people like Rudyard Kipling and Lily Langtry and a whole range of people from Victorian and Edwardian times. There's another series with Beatrix Potter, who was a children's illustrator of the early 1900s. And I like to find out things about people. I especially like to dig around in real people's stories and then ask myself, what would happen if I put this real person and his real events into a fictional framework? What would happen then? That really intrigues me. It's like Robert Frost once said about writing free-form poetry, which he thought was like playing tennis without a net, Having a net around me and when I'm writing historical fiction is really a nice thing.
What's interesting about what how you just characterized your interest as an author, it sounds very much like how the character in Loving Eleanor, how Hick felt about fiction as opposed to writing, true crime, things that, like actual events and people and whatnot. And I was that one of the reasons why you were drawn to that particular character? This is within Loving Eleanor.
Well, Lorena Hickok, she was an AP journalist, an Associated Press journalist. In fact, she was the very first woman to ever hold a reporter's position for the Associated Press. They brought her in 1928, and she was attracted to stories about women who were doing things. I mean, really interesting things. She wrote about a female flyer who flew under all of the bridges in the New York area. She wrote about a woman who had been a police person and was working with prostitutes. And she wrote about women who were doing wild and woolly things, and that's why she was attracted to Eleanor. So Lorena Hickok, was a writer who was invested in the real world. She wanted to tell it like it was. And I think her interest in Eleanor came because she was so fascinated by women who were doing unusual things. And Eleanor was a very unusual political wife in her day. She wasn't run of the mill by any means.
One of the things that I found interesting about your novel is that it feels like biography. It doesn't feel like fiction.
I'm glad you said that, and I take that as a compliment, but at the same time, there's a danger in that. And in fact, one reader wrote to me saying, I don't know how to draw the line between what's real and what's fictional in this book. And I try. At the end of the book, there's a biographical afterward where I detail the places in the novel where I go off the real world track, and invent things for the sake of the story. But I still try as hard as I can to be faithful to the two women in this story, Eleanor Roosevelt, whom we whom we all think we know, and Lorena Hickok, whom we don't know at all. But I feel as a writer, I have an obligation to tell their true story. That's confusing, isn't it? We're talking about fiction here, and yet there are many ways in which fiction can be truer than truth. There's a biography of Lorena Hickok called E.R.'s Friend by Doris Faber, which came out in 1980, right after the letters were released. The letters that document friendship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Lorena Hickok. The letters are held in the Franklin Roosevelt Library, and that's where Doris Faber found them. And she found out that she read the letters, understood the story, and hated the story. It was such a compelling story, and her husband was a newspaper editor for the New York Times, actually. And he said, "You got to tell the story, girl. There's a real blockbuster here." And she told the story in a way that diminishes Lorena. She wasn't true to the truth. And I think what I've tried to do, what I hope I've done with the novel, is to tell a truer story than Doris Faber tells in her homophobic biography. It's a wretched biography. Sorry, Doris Faber. Really. It's just
Tell me how you really feel. Well, I mean, that just speaks to history in general. The old quote that history is written by the victors. Those.
But really, this is off the subject. But I was watching Oliver Stone's Nixon night before last, and thinking that movie is so much truer than anything we know about the whole Watergate thing. Because as a fiction writer dealing with the real material, he's able to put it together in ways that bring up what we missed in real life. There was such a mess of stuff going on back in the early 70s when all that was happening. And in Loving Eleanor, I'm covering a period between 1928 with flashbacks to the early lives of these two women, 1928 to 1968. It's a long time. And with fictional compression and highlighting and foregrounding and backgrounding, you can compress a story in a way that brings up what I think are the true elements of the story in a way that I don't think not even a biographer can do. But we're blessed because Blanche Cook, Volume 3 of Eleanor Roosevelt is coming out in October. And a dual biography of Eleanor and Lorena is coming out in September. And I think that's wonderful. I'm really looking forward to both of those books.
A friend of mine is writing a historical about Louisa May Alcott.
Oh, yes.
And, reimagining or, what could possibly have been this person's life. And there are points of it that are so close and they feel like the biography of that person, and at the same time there's the liberation of being a fiction writer where you can kind of go in and reveal a part of a historical character and a possibility and maybe their internal thoughts, things that you don't get. Let's say if you have any historical author and you look at their stuff, you have things.
I still need to have some basis for getting into that character. A couple of things. Before I wrote Loving Eleanor, I wrote a book called A Wilder Rose. And it's about Rose Wilder Lane, who is the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder. And the true story there is that Rose actually wrote the little house books that are published under her mother's name. Her mother had the stories, piles of manuscript pages, but she was sort of like our grandmothers, She was not a writer. Rose was a writer. She was a much published writer. She was a best-selling author in the 1920s. and she actually wrote the Little House book. And in my fiction, I worked through Rose's diary to document the story of her relationship with her mother, which was not a very easy one, conflicted relationship, to tell the story of how those books got written. And so I think if we're going to go into the imagination of the characters, these real people, we really do need to have some basis for that. Letters, diaries, memoirs, yes, but as memoirists, we create ourselves as fictional characters. So they're not quite as trustworthy as actual letters and diaries. Seems to me, at any rate.
What biographies that you've personally enjoyed what do you feel those that are most connected to the truth? Like what are some biographies that you feel this is a good example of this particular character or historical
but the best one by far, and it's related to Loving Eleanor, is Blanche Cook's first two volumes of Eleanor Roosevelt's life. I mean, she understands Roosevelt absolutely and clearly, and her writing is just first rate. Her documentation is so very good, so very strong. I'm working with some biographies now. Well, I'll just give you one example. I'm working on a historical set in World War II, and it's the story of Dwight Eisenhower and his main squeeze in the Second World War, Kay Summersby, who was his driver, and his wife, Mamie. I have a biography of Mamie, which is written by Mamie's granddaughter. And it is, as you might imagine, a story that the story of Mamie Eisenhower that the Eisenhowers wanted told. Not a trustworthy biography at all. There are many revealing things in it, but what's revealing about it is not what the author, Mamie Eisenhower's granddaughter, intended to reveal.
Do you have a history in journalism?
No, I have a history in research. I'm a medievalist by trade. I did my graduate work at Berkeley, and I studied medieval literature, and I fell in love with just doing research. I just loved to pick up stuff. And then I decided I wanted to make my living as a writer, so putting together research and writing historicals are just about, sheer bliss. That's heaven, as far as I'm concerned.
How do you work to make sure that your research doesn't overrun the story?
Oh, that's hard, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Especially for those who really love research. Mine probably does. I do want the reader to be entertained by the story, but I'm also a teacher, and I want my readers to learn from the story. And if a reader says to me, oh gosh, I learned some things about that person or about that time or that place, or even in my mysteries. I have one series of mysteries that character is an herbalist. And so she's always trying to tell people things about herbs. And if somebody says to me, oh, I just learned so much from that mystery, that really, that sets me off. I'm very happy about that. But I do probably overload. We have to be careful not to slow things down or drag things down with too much information in that part. I think it varies from author to author. Some authors can do more with that than others.
I think it's a skill set, especially with the book that you've written that I've read. There's so much information packed into the story. It doesn't feel like reading a recipe, a list of facts or timelines. So it's not done improperly, but there's so much in it. And I think because there's so much grounding, it makes people feel like this is a biography rather than a fiction novel. Bizarre things stuck in my head, and I think one of the things when I was reading earlier in the book, you're describing, I think it was the funeral service for Eleanor Roosevelt, and that, I can't remember which character, but he was bald as an onion. That's stuck in my head.
Well, Oh, right, that's Adlai Stevenson, and he was. and Eleanor was his friend, but she knew he didn't have a chance at the presidency. And I had a line in there about Lyndon Johnson, that old lech, and I took it out because I thought it might be offensive. But I was reading over that the other day and thinking, damn, I wish I'd left that line in there because that really was true about Lyndon Johnson. It really was. And it is hard to know how far to go with revealing people, showing people warts. You know, we do owe it, I think, to readers to give them as much as we can, but not just to be sensational. And that was one of the things that concerned me about writing this book. I didn't want the book to be a sensation, because it was just a loving friendship. It was an intense and a passionate love affair for a couple of years, and then it did what a lot of friendships do. You know, it warmed into a slow-burning fire that just kept them warm for the rest of their lives. What lucky women those two were.
Aww.
Really, they were. They were. To have somebody that each one of them could lean on, although I have to say that nobody ever leaned on Eleanor Roosevelt if they did, because she was like a whirling dervish, you know. She just was here and gone. Some people in the 1930s and 40s called her Eleanor Everywhere. And she was like, oh, wonderful cartoon of Eleanor Roosevelt on a flying carpet. Flying over the globe.
I was reading recently this historical novel by Vanden. It's called Juliana, and we had an interview together, and she said that one of the things, because she also teaches, one of the things that she likes about writing historical fiction is that it makes history accessible to those who wouldn't be as passionate as you are, and you know, doing research, being in the library, following the curiosity, and you know, that it have that balance between entertainment and, you know, sense of place, sense of time, and history. And I like it because it's this very kind of democratizing of information in the way that, you know, a lot of people would not have access to. Education is different. People's reading styles are different. And so these kinds of stories that you write and that Vanden writes and other historical fiction authors is making time periods not only accessible, but bringing forth a history that is often left behind, just like you were saying with Loving Eleanor, that you wanted to do their friendship and their lives together justice.
I think that's very true, and it's too bad in a way that history is taught in the classroom with this dry, factual basis, because kids don't get a sense of the intense story that is buried in the history, or that can emerge from the history, and fiction can bring that out. Historical fiction has gone through fads, and just in the years that I've been writing for a long time, but I remember back in the late 1980s trying to sell a historical fiction concept through an agent to an editor, and I just got turned down flat. That particular project would go like wildfire today. So right now, historical fiction is an important form. There's a lot of interest in it. I think in part also because it works well in film and television. There is a lot of historical, real-world, fact-based fiction in both of mediums, and so it's something we really get interested in. But that hasn't always been true. It's interesting to see how fads change, how reading cycles change.
Do you think that you were attracted to writing mystery because you love research?
I think so. I think so, but I have to be interested in story. And in biographical fiction, that means I really have to be interested in the person. You know, I'm finishing, I have about 90,000 words in this Eisenhower fiction. And I'm aiming for about 120,000, so I'm already thinking about the next project down the road, you know. What am I going to do after I finish that? Well, I have a mystery to write. Yes, I have a contract to fulfill, and I'll do that next. But what's after that? And so I began looking around, and I really enjoy telling women's stories. Partly because women's lives are like icebergs, you know. There's this little piece, real women, there's this little piece that we can see, but there's great, big, massive amount of stuff down below, things that are going on that we can get into in fiction. And I started looking around for another character, and I think I probably went through about 3 or 4. Libby Custer was one. George Armstrong Custer's wife, who was a fascinating woman, but she buried in her period. And then right now I'm looking at a woman named Daisy Stickley, who was a friend of Franklin Roosevelt, staying with Roosevelt. And oh, what a fascinating but very quiet life that woman led. Just imagining her life in this huge Gothic house that she lived in, not far from Roosevelt family home. It's really, really interesting.
How do you...
So I think I'm pulled in by the prospect of doing the research, yes, but also by the character. And she really has to have something going for her before I'm willing to invest a year or a year and a half or sometimes 2 years of my life.
What is the research process like for you? Like the tangible, how do you find the best primary sources? Like, how do you find the materials that may be dormant for most, but should be, you know, tugged out of the dust and used for a basis of writing a novel or a biography?
It's really different for different projects because different kinds of material are available. In Loving Eleanor, the main base for the book are the letters themselves, and they are held at the Franklin Roosevelt Library, and thank goodness they were. I mean, thank heaven that Lorena Hickok held onto those letters and didn't let them get into the hands of the Roosevelt family. Because if Eleanor's son had gotten those letters, we would not know anything about this friendship and how important it was. They just would not have permitted it. So that particular book had to be written in terms of what was available, that the documentation that the women created themselves. The Eisenhower book is really interesting because the main source of information are 2 different memoirs that Kay Summersby, Eisenhower's mistress during the Second World War, wrote. First one denying that she had any relationship with him, and the second one saying, "Oh, we had a love affair, yes, but it wasn't consummated." And I think both of those memoirs are full of fiction. And so I dig down into it to try to find what kinds of truth might be buried within it. If I do the book on Daisy Stickley, I'll go to the Stickley family home, which is in Rhinebeck, New York, and read through Daisy's diary to see what kind of a person she was and use them as a starting point. So it very much depends on what's available. But I keep coming back to those letters and thinking that if Hick had allowed Joseph Lash, Eleanor's biographer, to have them, he would have turned them over to the Roosevelt boys. And just thinking, how easily those letters could have been destroyed.
And that also speaks to how many histories we've lost because of that kind of behavior on the part of heirs or people who are currently living and want to erase that kind of history and make it invisible. So,
and just think, we don't write letters anymore. And many of us don't keep diaries, at least not in the way diaries used to be kept. What's going to document our friendships now? Only what we leave on Facebook and Twitter. That's a kind of an ephemeral legacy.
It's true. or messaging, but even still, it's not the same kind of window into someone's inner life.
Exactly. No, exactly. And it doesn't have the intimacy that letters. I mean, one of the wonderful things about the Eleanor and Lorena letters is that they're continued over such a long period of time, and so you can see the women changing. The Eleanor that Lorena fell in love with in 1933 was not the Eleanor that Lorena decided she needed to step away from in 1936, and you can see it in Eleanor's letters. And the Lorena that fell in love with Marion Herron in the early 1940s was not the same Lorena that said goodbye to Marion Herron, and you can see that in the letters. You can see the people changing over. You can see those two women changing over an extended period of time. It's a fascinating glimpse into their lives and into the single life that they created together, even though they weren't together physically for much of the time.
It's, one of the things that is tempting with historical fiction, especially if it's romantic fiction, is to have a happily ever after. In real life, a lot of that doesn't happen. A friend of mine, Lynn Ames, she writes historical fictions, and she had this one story called Eyes on the Stars. And it was about women. Have you read that one?
No, I haven't.
Okay. It's basically about a women fighter pilot. And basically they didn't get to go in the front, but they were, using planes that were somewhat dilapidated, but they were, transferring, almost like taking things from one place to another. They never got anything glorified. But anyway, there was a lot of pressure for these women to show that they're heterosexual. To go on dates and dress a certain way and not to seem to have any close relationships with women that would get in their way with relationships with men. There was such heartbreak. There's this, beautiful connection between these two characters, but in the attempt to kind of hide their sexuality just so they can keep on doing the work that they wanted to do, had disastrous consequences. And I remember, there's a slight happily ever at the end, but I remember crying so much when I was reading it, and I tried to explain it to my spouse, and I couldn't make sense because I was just crying because it was so sad. And then I was going out to dinner the night that I had finished.
But think how deeply you were moved by that, and so many of the happy endings, the reconciliation that we find in genre fiction, so much of that is false. And we feel that, and yet we can close the book, and say, okay, it's done, and then we go away and forget it. But when we are deeply moved by a story that asks us to feel, and not necessarily to feel a perfect closure, that stays with us. You won't ever forget crying about that, or that.
It was just so. It was so heartbreaking, and the thing is, horrible, awful things obviously have happened in the lives of women, and having agency and having control over your life. It even comes up early on in Loving Eleanor, where Hick's life was very difficult when she was younger, and if she tried to be more meek or acquiescing with her father, that she'd probably get less fiction, but that wasn't who she was.
Right.
And so she just lived a very true life and a very hard life. And I'm like, wow, the cojones that it must have taken to step into the breach, especially Associated Press, and getting real stories, not the society pages. She was a very impressive individual.
Yes, and I think about, as you were saying that, I think, and that's one of the things that Doris Faber tried to show her as a victim. And as you're describing it, Hick is developing a character that allows her to stand up and thumb her nose at the things that come her way that want to push her down. And yet her biographer says, well, she was a victim in her early life. She wasn't.
Yeah,
wasn't a
I liked at one point she was thinking about her life, and she's like, I think what saved me was my sense of irony, and the little voice inside her like fighting back, and then she said that's what helped her over her life, beat back any kind of depression or woe is me kind of thing, and just soldier on.
Exactly. And I think she heard that same voice in Eleanor, and that was the voice that she wanted Eleanor to speak with to the world. I think that if we remember anything about Lorena Hickok, I think it should be that she gave Eleanor a voice. She encouraged Eleanor to stand up there in front of those newspaper women and do something that a first lady had never, ever, ever done. It was unthinkable. Stand up there in front of a group of newspaper reporters and hold a press conference in the White House. And then to write the column, a daily newspaper column. That was Lorena's idea. Lorena said, I can even tell you the syndicate that you should go to and get this done. And then when it came to writing her memoir, Lorena said, okay, I'll help. And Eleanor was not a good writer. She was a kind of a steadfast writer. She could get the words down, but Lorena helped her by editing it, and then Eleanor learned. So Lorena really helped to give her that voice, and I think it was the same voice of resistance that Lorena herself grew up with, somehow or another within herself, that she was a young girl.
What kind of message would you like to leave for your readers and fans?
Well, readers of Loving Eleanor, all you out there, you wonderful women, I hope you will read the resources at the back of the book. And if you enjoy the story, I hope you'll do some more digging. I hope you'll turn into researchers yourself and listen for the voices of women that don't often get heard, that sometimes get buried under the general noise of the culture. We all have stories. We have hundreds of stories, and they're all true. And they need to be told. So I hope you'll read Loving Eleanor and then read more.
You have that great little, at least me, as a little girl, I was always hunting for treasures in the house. Letters, pictures, treasure maps, whatever, that very fantastical notion.
Right, and they have a story.
Yes.
And,
yes. So I agree with you. I like the message. And I also like that you're giving a voice to women who may have been forgotten otherwise. And that's one of my personal missions, is to give voice to things that are often silenced. I'm really grateful for the chance to meet you, Susan. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it very, very much.